Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order and the Morris Winchevsky Center. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around in Canada since the 1920s. Well, it's the end of summer, and that means the school year is gearing up again, and in this community, that means the Morris Winchevsky Shula is back in session. Our shula runs out of its downtown Toronto campus at 918 Bathurst Street from September to June every year and offers innovative, secular, social justice-oriented Jewish education for children, youth, and adults. And in honor of the new school year, this month's podcast is dedicated entirely to our shula. We'll hear from Esther Ryder, longtime United Jewish People's Order member and resident historian, and Leah Tarachansky, our education director and shula runner. As an aside, I found it telling and inspiring in a way that these two great minds have much in common, but also diverge significantly in their attitude towards the Yiddish component of contemporary Jewish education. Kind of a perfect distillation of the healthy, dare I say, Talmudic-style debate and analysis in our midst. But most importantly, perhaps, in this episode, we'll hear excerpts throughout from a podcast created by students from the shula, in which they and shula faculty discuss some of the burning questions they encounter in their education there. Take it away, shula students.
Hi, I'm Max.
I'm Roxy.
I'm Rose.
I'm Franny.
And I'm Ella.
This is Morris Winchevsky's podcast, These Great Questions.
This week, we went around asking questions to the students, teachers, and staff of the Winchevsky School and discussed the answers afterward.
My name is Keegan, and I'm in Alex's class, whatever it is. My name's Gabriel, and I'm in Miriam's class.
In shul, we learn about things that have happened throughout Jewish history. Why should we, as members of this community, care about the past?
Why should we care about the past? Well, because I'm gonna guess we want to know how Earth was created and
Not that far back.
Not that far back.
Like
Not that far back. Okay. Because we want to remember awesome stuff that people did, which was not that long ago.
Why do we learn about it?
We learn about it to remember all the Jewish holidays and celebrate it here. My name is Julian, and I'm in the grade 1 to 3 class.
My name is Dash, and I'm in the 1 to grade 3 class.
So we can learn about our religion and know how it works.
So we can learn about our religion.
Why would you want to know about your religion?
Well, we don't want
Because
to.
it's important for your family and for you to know. So if you go to a place that's for your religion, you're not hello, I'm Jewish, and then they ask you all these questions and you don't know any of them.
So we've just heard a bunch of different answers about why we should care about the past, and I'm curious to know what the podcast team thinks. So Roxy, we're going to start with you. If you want to answer, why do you think, or what did you think based on those answers, and why do you think we should care about the past?
Okay. Without the past, you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. And the past is teaching us what we have done wrong in the past and to do better in the future.
Yes, because if you could make the exact same mistake that you made in the past if you don't remember the past, if you don't remember what happened.
I liked what Keegan said. I liked that not only about remembering. I always think that remembering what happened in the past is always a bit the past was really miserable because there was all these mistakes that were made. But I liked how Keegan said because we want to remember all the awesome stuff that people have done too. I thought that was a really nice twist. It's not about, we need to remember the past so that we can do the amazing things that they did in the future. I thought it was a really nice twist.
Thanks for listening to
These Great Questions.
So, to really celebrate the Winchevsky Shula, we thought we would go right back to the beginning and try to get some context, some deep historical knowledge about the origins of the radical shul movement, the radical school movement in North America. I spoke to the great Esther Ryder, a much-beloved United Jewish People's Order community member and real expert on the history of Canada's Jewish left. Esther is Professor Emerita in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University and the author of such books as Making Fast Food from the Frying Pan into the Fryer and A Future Without Hate or Need, The Promise of the Jewish Left in Canada. When we spoke last week, she was in Montreal. Hello, Esther. Thanks so much for being part of the podcast. How are you today?
Fine, my pleasure. I'm in beautiful downtown Montreal.
Oh, lucky you. As you know, the Shula is gearing up to start the September season, and so we're celebrating the school and everything it stands for. And I just wanted, because you're kind of in some ways the resident historian of Ujbo and Chesky. And I wanted to just get some perspectives on the history of the Winchevsky Shula, but also the traditions, the history of the radical Shula movement that started in the beginning of the 20th century, and kind of give everything context. So, can you tell me about the first radical Shulas? When and where did they originate, and who created them?
Well, apparently, what I read is that the radical shulas began actually in 1910, and it was the impetus of a left-wing Zionist who was a Yiddishist named Zhitlowski. And he's saying, listen, people, if you want to talk to a lot of people, you have to speak Yiddish, and the children have to learn Yiddish. And the first shula, I think the first shula actually might have been in Montreal. I'm not positive about that, but it was a North American movement in both Canada and the United States. And initially, it included all the different Bewegungen, all the different movements. As long as you were opposed to the capitalist system and you were left wing and you believed in Yiddish, you were then part of the Radikale Shula movement. Now, that unity did not last long, because the unity included people with with different convictions. They were all left wing. Some were Zionists, some were socialists, some were anarchists, but they were all together in forming the Radikale Shula movement. At one point, they split up. We were part of the Workmen's Circle, the Arbeitering movement. But then what happened? The Arbeitering, I think, split off, started their own shulas a little bit later, maybe 1918, 1917. But then what happened after the Soviet Revolution? Then there really was a big split, and it's really both the U.S. and Canada is what I can speak to, because what happened with us is we looked to what was happening with the Bolshevik Revolution, the kind of support they were giving for Yiddish schools, Yiddish learning, Yiddish culture in those initial years, outlawing as anti-Semitism. I didn't get rid of anti-Semitism, but the idea that it was outlawed, the incredible battles that were going on, where it was really the Red Army that was controlling the slaughter of Jews that was happening with the White Army. So we split off. And we split off both in Canada and the United States. In the United States, they formed these independent shulas. They call them the Unparteiische Schulen, the independent shulas. And in Canada, I don't really know the history in Montreal so much, unfortunately, but in Winnipeg, in Toronto, they formed our shula, the Winchevsky Shula. It was a little bit different in Winnipeg. The shula in Winnipeg stayed together until 2930, and then they too formed the Shalom Aleichem Shula as an independent left-wing shula. Now, I will go on. I had the good fortune. One time I was in the library in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I was able to have a look at some of the textbooks that were used in those very early years. And they were so radical. Oh my God. First of all, the titles of the books were things like Wir lernen und kämpfen. We don't just learn, we learn and we struggle, because learning Yiddishkeit meant not only for ourselves, learning Yiddishkeit meant being involved in revolution, being involved in international struggles for social justice. So, it made me laugh, because you're talking about trying to teach politics to kids that are 8, 9, 10 years old. But, they're learning about, you like to play ball. We ever think how they made rubber in the Congo, and talking about the exploitation there. And then, of course, labor unions. One story, a father goes off to the picket line and comes back with a bandaged head. And the next day, the whole family goes on the picket line and they win. So I loved, I really got a kid. I really found it interesting how learning Yiddish in those early years was so integrated with learning to be a progressive person, to learning anti-racism. Mind you, the heavy stuff with that was anti-Black anti-racism. They weren't so great with Asians, but knew, what they did do. I don't know. I really loved it. And I want to say one more thing about those early movements. You know what? Couldn't have happened without the ladies. The women were amazing in terms of helping the kids, because it wasn't just learning Yiddish. Oh my God, you had to have singing, you had to have dancing, you had to have plays. Who do you think cooked and baked and made the costumes for the children? Who actually went on fundraising drives to support the shulas? But the women. And that wasn't enough. The women said, well, we want to learn too. And that's when they formed these Lehenkreis and these reading circles that were also connected to the shulas, where the women would spend time educating themselves. So, it's a very I don't know.
Yeah, it's an amazing history.
history.
In your heart of hearts, because things have really changed, of course. It's a miracle. It's so wonderful and such a blessing that we still have our school in the 21st century. Who would have thought that we would still have this progressive secular, to a point, Yiddish-oriented school? It's pretty amazing. In your heart of hearts, as a writer, what does 21st century Jewish education look like to you? If you could design the curriculum, what elements would be in there?
First of all, I really, really hope for more of a revival and an understanding of the importance of Yiddish in the curriculum, and that it's not just learning a language, it's learning. And of course, Yiddish is also used by the ultra-Orthodox. So, this we know. But I think for our shulas, learning Yiddish is learning a particular view of the world. It's learning about a very rich working people's culture that we come from, that we have so much to be proud of. It's learning, I'm not sure how to put it. It's like, again, it's a path into learning that to have a Jewish identity is to learn what you're for, not only what you're against. And God knows there's enough to be against these days, right? But I love Yiddish because of the beauty of the writers, the singing, the culture that it puts forward, which is an empathy toward a respect for our history, but a respect for other people's history as well, particularly with those that are, people that are having a hard time, that are really oppressed, and an anti-capitalist and anti-establishment thing that you just wear with pride. You wear with pride. It's not only about hating and being angry at terrible things in the world. It's working with somehow holding on, and these days it's pretty hard, a vision of a different kind of a future that I think that it brought. And so for me, somehow that's connected with the beauty of the language and the songs, and I don't know.
One last question for you, Esther. Can you tell me a bit about Morris Winchevsky?
Okay. Well, he was in Morris Winchevsky. I mean, he's called like the Zayd of, the grandfather of Yiddish culture. And he was very interesting. I think I wish I knew more about him. But he started out, I believe, as an anarchist. And he kind of moved to the left with the times. And again, he was just absolutely, staunch Yiddishist in impressing the importance of the Yiddish language. And I mean, he actually moved to the left over the years and became quite pro-communist, because he just thought that was where the important transformations were happening. Sadly, we know that that's not exactly what was going on in the Soviet Union, but we do honor Morris Winchevsky for his works, for his writings, and for the kind of person that he was.
It is interesting to me, given the zeitgeist of the Jewish left right now, given our culture here at Ujpo Winchevsky, that he was, and I think this kind of illustrates something about Jewish history, Jewish left history. He was a Zionist, yeah?
He started out like that, yeah.
And it shows that Zionism has evolved over the years and was very an intrinsically left, or not intrinsically left, but there was definitely a left strain of Zionism back in those early days.
Well, you know what? In our community, there was a woman that I would love so much. Her name was Brenda Fischoff. I was in her Lehenkais, and she described to me how in her shtetl Stashev, all of them were part of the left Zionist movement, and the discussion was, where do we make revolution? Do we make revolution here in Europe, or do we make it over there in Palestine? And what she said is it was very hard to get to Palestine. So the whole gang became communists, fervent communists. So, like now, because the dominant stream of Zionism is so hateful, I don't even want to go there. We kind of forget that people were Marxists, and some of the discussion was, should it be here or should it be there? Let's make it here. Now, I grew up always not Zionist, not necessarily anti-Zionist, but not Zionist. No, we make revolution here and we make it for everybody. But I think it needs to be understood that just after the Holocaust, when so many, millions and millions of people had been killed, and every single country, like, Canada, the US, would not exactly say, oh, come on over, all you people who managed to survive. We looked at Israel saying, okay, they didn't kill us all. So, there was amongst, I think, all of us are looking at that country in a very different way than a lot of progressive people do now, particularly these days with the horrible new government.
Well, thank you, Esther. This is quite illuminating, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day in Montreal.
Judaism teaches us to help people in need.
Yeah.
Why should we? Why should we help people who need us?
So they feel happy.
Okay. But why should you? go out of your way to help people?
Because to be nice,
Who told you that? Has someone told you that's what you should do?
my teacher.
I am Max Pierce Bassman, and I am in B'nai Mitzvah.
Judaism teaches us to help people in need. Why should we?
I believe that people want to because because evolution has hardwired the brain for cooperation, and doing good things to other people is the best way to survive in nature, and that hasn't gone away.
My name is Alex Barnes, and I am the teacher for the grade 4 to 6 class. I think we have an obligation as human beings to treat each other as equals, right? Everyone around me, everyone who's a person, is just as much of a human being as I am, and I think I should treat them in the way that I expect to be treated. I think there's like this idea of an equality of human value and the idea of social responsibility, that just because my life might be going well doesn't mean that I earned that going wellness in my life. I'm obligated to help people who might not have the same opportunities that I had, or might not be in the same situation as I am, because it's not their fault that they're there necessarily. And even if it was their fault that they're there, they probably have recognized errors or mistakes or things that they would have done differently. And in those positions of need, they tend to be unable to fix it for them. So they need the help from people around them. And I think that's a very powerful idea of feeling responsible for your fellow man and fellow person just because they are the same, like they are a person just as you are. I think there's a Hebrew phrase called Shivyon Erech HaAdam, which means the equality of human value, which I think is a very important phrase to keep in mind when thinking about things like this.
I am Orly Kay, and my class is the 4 to 6. Well, it's nice, and there are people in need out there. Right now, there are, I think I heard this from the news, there are over about 5,000 people on the streets just in Toronto. There's always more people coming into the world, so we have to keep the people in the world at the moment.
I'm Natalie, and I'm a teacher assistant for part-time kindergartners and part-time B'nai Mitzvah class. I feel like in society, if we were helpful to other people, they would be helpful to more people. And if you just do something simple each day, like holding a door for someone, that person may hold the door for someone else. Like small gestures throughout life of doing something nice to someone else can really make their day like happy. And I think we should always help people in need because they need help, and we should offer it to them.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. What do you think? Do you think it's your responsibility to do nice things to people?
I think it's everybody's responsibility to do nice things. And I think, like Natalie said, that little things, even though they're small, will help a lot of people, and it has a pretty big impact. Thanks for listening to These Great Questions.
One of the most exciting aspects of the Morrison-Chesky Shula in its current form is the amazing curriculum that's been developed of late, spearheaded by Leah Tarachansky, the Morrison-Chesky Shula Education Director. Leah is a journalist, filmmaker, and multimedia artist. Born in the former Soviet Union, she grew up in Israel-Palestine and then moved to Canada, Turtle Island. She's worked as video journalist, investigative reporter, and writer. She's also an amazing documentary filmmaker and is currently working on her PhD at York University. I spoke to her about her journey to her current job and her priorities when putting together a model of Jewish education in the 21st century. Leah Tarachansky, thanks so much for being part of this month's podcast. How are you today?
I am doing good. How are you doing?
Can you just go over very briefly your responsibilities as, quote, education director, unquote? What do you handle?
So I run the shula. So that means running the shula on Sundays during the day, making sure that all the classes are run well, popping in and providing a lot of context in moments when, for example, we need a historical context, doing a lot of emotional regulation with kids and with the anybody, the TAs, the teachers, hiring the teachers and training them, hiring and training the teachers' assistants, helping the Shula assistant with snack. But the most exciting part of my job is obviously working with the kids and making the curriculum. So when I started working at the Winchevsky Shula, we had kind of a bit of an outline, and now we have this enormous living conglomerate of materials and practices and traditions and multimedia and guidelines that spans 4,000 years of Jewish history. I've written a lot of guidelines about how to teach the Holocaust and how to teach Israel and Palestine and how to do emotional regulation with kids. We created a secular encyclopedia of Jewish symbols. We've created a secular encyclopedia of Jewish traditions and how to understand them. We also created a whole guideline of secular prayers. So that's been a really fun and a really exciting kind of intellectually stimulating part of my job. But most of it is just being present on Sundays and making sure that the Michigaz is running to the pace of a normal Michigaz, and that everybody is safe and educated and fed.
And how important is the secular part of all this to you? I mean, that might sound like a silly and obvious question, but how important is that element of this community?
To me as an education director, or to me as Leah Tarachansky?
Both.
As an education director, it's very exciting to be able to mobilize the secular education that I got in Israel for non-Zionist means. So we were taught, obviously, Bible class in Israeli schools, but it was not taught in the way that the idea that like this is what happened and that's the end of the story. It was taught as in like, here are some stories that a lot of Jewish values and Jewish traditions are based on. And so any person who grows up in Israel feels very comfortable with the concept of Jewish secular education, because that's what we get as part of our school system. Every Israeli is taught, Jewish traditions and practices. Now, usually it's taught in a way that centers Ashkenazi, the Ashkenazi rabbinical tradition, and is usually taught to us as this is the right way. The right way is typically something that is made to look eternal, but that actually comes from a 300-year period in Eastern Europe. And it took me a long time to liberate my understanding of Jewish practices, traditions, and histories out of that. It took a very, very long time. And Uchbo and Winchevsky were a fundamental part of that. Before that, obviously, Independent Jewish Voices was a very big part of that. But IJV typically does Palestine activism, not so much Jewishness. So being able to like literally liberate the Jewish history out of the rabbinical colonization of it was a very fun and exciting, and is a very central part of what we do at the Shula. So centering the secular aspects of Jewishness, which at its core, Jewishness is an experiential tradition. So by doing the holidays, by doing these Shabbat candle lightings, by doing secular prayers, we are experiencing certain aspects of human learning every single year. And I see the Shula as a kind of microcosm for that. On a personal level, the secular part is very interesting, and it's a really good framework. I'm not on a personal level very attached to the secular identity, because I'm not really attached to identity politics in general. I don't really spend time thinking about my labels. So some things I find really spiritually interesting, some things I find really secularly interesting, and some things I find interesting on an atheist level. I like to be very flexible with these things.
All this, of course, relates to my next question. Not only the Shula, but the tradition of secular radical Shulas in general, going back to the early part of the 20th century, has always been dedicated to, or at least at the beginning, was dedicated to a kind of Yiddishist mentality. So not only teaching in Yiddish, having an attachment to the idea that there needs to be a Yiddish legacy, but also teaching pretty much a Marxist class analysis to young kids with the idea that this would breed activists with class consciousness. So the question I have for you, and you sort of already answered part of this, is as a Hebrew speaker, as an Israeli, how have you squared this legacy with your own priorities as an educator and a curriculum designer?
So I just want to clarify that my personal background is not a part of it's not a motivating force in any of my curriculum design. It's just that oftentimes when I meet North American Jews, they say secular Jewishness. What is that? And being an Israeli, it's very simple because we like the 75% of Israelis are secular Jews, and have no problem understanding what that means in terms of tradition and culture. And it's all very simple to when you grow up in it. So that's kind of why I brought up my personal background, but it has not, I don't think that it has contributed to the curriculum writing, with the exception of the fact that obviously I've been dedicated to Israel, Palestine, justice and peace for 20 years. And that has been integrated into the curriculum because it's a social justice based curriculum. Where we started in the 1920s is not where we are today. Our community is very different and our needs are very different. I do understand the importance of a Marxist class analysis, but the world today is a lot more intersectional. Our community is a lot more culturally diverse. We have integrated Yiddish and obviously Eastern European traditions into every aspect of the education, but we've also included other languages, including, of course, Hebrew and Ladino and Judeo-Arabic. And a lot of our community comes from places that are not in Eastern Europe. And so de-Ashkenizing the curriculum in a sense of decolonization of the curriculum has been a very important project of mine. I've also queered the curriculum in a lot of places, and we are always thinking about how to queer the curriculum further so that we are not replicating the oppressive gender norms that a lot of the Jewish communities still attach to. Everything that we do, every class that we teach has a social justice component, which is not just class based. So we do try to intersect those things. I think that they are inseparable. I don't think you can understand class without understanding the history of colonialism. I don't think you can understand the history of colonialism without understanding the development of the concept of race and racism. So all of those things are baked into every single class. As is the most excitingly experiential education. So we don't do frontal learning, we don't do lectures. A lot of what our classes are based on games and experiential exercises and hands-on activities, so that the kids get to really practice Jewishly. And what they're practicing Jewishly is not just Jewish history and Jewish traditions, but also social justice.
You mentioned Jewish history as being an important learning component. How do you define Jewish history? And is there, I assume the answer to this is going to be yes, but I think it's very interesting because we are a secular community. Where do discussions and learning pieces about Jewish religious practices and histories fit into left secular learning? And how is this manifested in your curriculum?
So as I mentioned, most Jewish traditions are based around experiential learning. So, for example, if you take the upcoming Rosh Hashanah, on Rosh Hashanah, there's a lot of traditions and symbols that are there for you to practice concepts that our ancestors wanted you to learn. These are really valuable things for us. So, for example, thinking, we eat the head of the fish to remind ourselves that we are going to be the leaders of our lives in the year to come. We also eat circular fruit like apples and pomegranates to remind us that of the cyclicity of the Jewish year, and that things that that go often return, and that life can often be a spiral. This has been a tough year for a lot of people. So when you dip the apples in honey, it's a reminder that to have hope for the sweeter things to come. So those symbols have nothing to do with religion in the traditional sense of Christianity, where religion is seen as something separate from practice. In Jewishness, in Islam, in a lot of indigenous ways of being, what we are is a part of how we practice. There isn't an external component called religion. So whether or not you in your heart of hearts believe in God is irrelevant to me. And if you spend enough time with religious communities, and I just made it, I'm in the middle of working on a 6-year film where I've spent 6 years in and out of extremely Orthodox communities. You realize that God is not even at the core of what they do. Most of what they do has to do with the traditions, the practices, and the values. So we focus on the tradition, the practices, and the values. And I think that we do that in a way that really honors Jewish ancestry and Jewish tradition. And I feel proud of the way that I've carried on things that as a Soviet-born person, I wasn't allowed to practice. And I've managed to kind of resuscitate a lot of things that were lost to me because of anti-Semitism. So I do feel that in that way, we are a traditional Jewish community that's practicing in secular and contemporary modern ways.
So interesting. Maybe also what I'm getting at is, let's say I was advertising the shula to parents who are not sure if they want to be involved in a secular school for their kids. Are you teaching, this is the Gemara, this is the Mishnah, the Talmud, this is what the tradition. Are you teaching these elements even though they are directly connected to a religious history? Maybe that's what I was getting at. What does Jewish history mean?
I don't know that they are. I mean, if you read a page of the Talmud, what the Talmud at its core, the experiential lesson of the Talmud is that you take a piece of the oral or written history from the Chumash, and you have a plenitude of voices interact with it. Some people are going to tell a parable about that sentence. Some people are going to have an interpretation of what might have been meant by that sentence. Others are going to add context. Jewishness is based on experiential learning, and that's something that's integrated into every aspect of the shula. So if parents who don't know us are thinking of joining us, I think we have a very exciting shula. I think that we offer a really in-depth, really unique, really high-level education. And it's not that we say, we're not an atheist school. It's not that we say God does not exist, end of story. The idea of God is ridiculous. God comes up as a character constantly in our discussions. Students ask a lot of questions about the divine. We don't teach that the divine is the driving force of human existence or even the planet or the universe. But we definitely have really interesting conversations about where do these stories of divinity come from. And one of the ways we do that is through comparative traditions. So, for example, one of the first themes of the curriculum is creation. And we learn about the Jewish myth of creation in the context of Mesopotamian myths of creation, in the context of indigenous myths of creation. And what we want to ask the students to really think deeply on why is it that cultures across the planet have created myths of creation? What do these stories tell us? What role can they play for us in these contemporary times?
Wow, I mean, it sounds like a really in-depth and fascinating way to teach kids about Jewishness, and might have that last description you made might be a little bit of a surprise to people who might be hesitant to enroll their kids in a so-called left secular school, because it sounds really quite in-depth and well thought out and inclusive in terms of Jewish approaches to Jewish learning.
When new families come to us, the story I typically hear was, I sent my kids to this place and it was awful for this or that reason. I am so excited to find a space where we can learn without the constant, focus on Israel, without decontextualizing Israel out of the rich Jewish history, or focusing on God and the idea that everything that's unexplainable is therefore the divinity, which is something that a lot of the families have expressed that they get frustrated by. They want to have their own personal familial relationship to God, and they want their children to have a solid, all-encompassing historical, traditional, practical education in Jewishness, so that they can find their own paths towards what it means to have Jewish spirituality.
So it's the ever-changing, non-static legacy of the Winchevsky Shula, and it's very exciting.
100%. One of the things that I bought into, that I was taught in my Jewish education as a kid, is that there's the traditional way, and then there's all these crazy ways in which recently all these Jews have been changing things. But when you actually look at the history of Jewishness from the days of Abraham, it has always been a cacophony of voices. It has always been diverse. It has always been changing. If you just look at the way communities have been practicing the holidays across the planet, every community is changing, and every practice of Jewishness is always undergoing evolution, and we are a part of that.
Leah, how important is Israel-Palestine content to your curriculum, and how do you go about teaching it?
So when we teach Israel and Palestine, first of all, we teach it within the larger context of 4,000 years of Jewishness, which I feel a lot of schools really focus on Israel as, Holocaust and Israel as the only two pillars of Jewishness that get any kind of in-depth learning. And I think that that's a huge disservice to the students. And secondly, we teach Israel and Palestine within the history of nationalism and colonialism, so that students understand the landscape and the political situation in Israel-Palestine as it is today. And this is one place where my personal history does play a part. I worked for 12 years as a journalist in Israel-Palestine, and a correspondent, a video journalist, and a documentary filmmaker. So I got a chance to see pretty extensively what Israel is and Palestine is like for Israelis and for Palestinians. And that had played a big role in when I was constructing our guidelines for teaching Israel-Palestine, so that the students get a kind of contextual and accurate image of what Israel and Palestine is like for all the peoples that live there. And then we prepare for that theme by teaching, of course, the rise of anti-Semitism in the 20th century and the 19th century, the rise of specifically the creation of the Pale of Settlement, and the rise of the need for Jews to flee in the first place, so that when we get to Zionism as a political movement that emerges in the second half of the 19th century, the students have a really solid understanding also of the revolutionary history of that time, of how incredibly tumultuous and exciting it would have been to be part of workers' movements, labor's movements, socialist movements, anarchist movements, the revolutionary traditions that led to the abolishment of monarchies, all of the context inside of which contemporary modern Zionism emerged. And to really make sure that they understand the roots of Zionism and what it held on to inside of the larger Jewish tradition. So that if those students end up going to Israel-Palestine as adults, they get a really solid understanding of the place that they're visiting.
So just to be sort of soundbite-ish and concise, is a Morris Winchevsky school approach to Israel-Palestine, is it anti-Zionist? Is it Zionist critical? Is there an easy way to characterize it in that way?
The Morris Winchevsky school teaches the context inside of which Zionism emerged as a political movement, so that our students have a really solid understanding of Israel-Palestine within the context of nationalism and colonialism.
All right. Well, that is very refreshing to me, I have to say, and should be yet another reason for people to enroll their kids at Winchevsky.
Yeah, it's kind of like our approach to God, we don't teach God doesn't exist, God exists. We make sure that students understand, both through Jewish and comparative learning, why God was invented, what are the purposes of the divine in this larger story of Jewishness. And it also is how we teach the Holocaust. I find that a lot of the Jewish schools in Toronto in particular, and also a lot of the Jewish education that people in my community that outside of Winchevsky have been raised on, is that anti-Semitism is eternal. It is a feature of life on earth, and it is something that cannot ever end. It is an exceptional form of racism, and the Holocaust is something that cannot be taught in context. It has to be exceptionalized. When I first started, Winchevsky sent me to a training, an experiential certificate training, where all the Jewish schools in Toronto, all their education directors were learning there as well. And when the conversation on the Holocaust came up, that was the message. The Holocaust is unique. It cannot be compared to any other kind of genocide. It is the worst thing that has ever happened on earth. And it is part of a movement of racism called anti-Semitism that is just a natural phenomenon that is going to be there, has always been there, end of story. But when you learn Jewish history, first of all, anti-Semitism is not a permanent part of our experience. We've had, for example, you can't look at biblical Jews or biblical Israelites and see the context within which they were in conflict with their neighbors as anti-Semitism. That's a ridiculous decontextualization. I also don't want my students to grow up in a world where they believe that they are, no matter what they do, they are going to be hated. End of story. We have to believe, if we're fighting for social justice, that we want to get to a world where racism is obliterated. And we do teach anti-Semitism within the larger context of the development of racism, which is completely tied to colonialism as well. And when we teach the Holocaust, we teach it within the larger history of anti-Jewish violence that emerges in a particular place. The Holocaust is a Jewish story that is both specific, but is also to some extent universal amongst the Jewish people. But not all Jews experience the Holocaust. And I think that it's really important that we contextualize it within the diverse Jewish world as well.
Right. So it's about context, and it sounds a little bit like you are presenting through experiential learning all of this to kids, and they are coming to their own conclusions in a sense. You're not directing young minds to certain conclusions. You are presenting the evidence and the facts, and encouraging kids to have a kind of critical perspective and come to their own conclusions. Am I right?
Absolutely. Our guiding principle is social justice, experiential learning, and secular Jewishness. Where the kids land inside of that world is entirely up to them. We have fascinating discussions. A few years ago, we actually made a little podcast out of the great questions the kids ask in class, and we had the students interview each other. So the Morris Winchevsky Shula is a place for a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, and a lot of learning.
At the Winchevsky Center, we learn about the 10 Commandments. Many of them are instructions about how to treat each other nicely. Do we need these rules to be kind?
I don't think we need the rules to be kind, but if people are being rude or being mean, they should know the rules.
Okay, do you follow them? Do you follow the rules?
Most of the time.
My name is Roxy, and I'm in the class 4 to 6 with Alex. I think that they're not necessary, but there are different levels of kindness, and that from my perspective, they're not rules exactly, but the ways or the levels of kindness that people give.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to give an example of how you
some
mean?
people just say nice things, little things that have a big impact, like hi, and give compliments. And they have a big impact, whereas other people may do a big thing, like give a charity or fundraise some money, or most people, I'm hoping, do it out of kindness, but not everybody, since not everybody has the same opinion about this matter, but yes.
What is your name?
Miriam.
And what class are you in?
I'm the teacher for the grades 1 to 3 class.
Okay. Do we need these rules to be kind?
Do we need these rules? Well, I think that in any group situation, you need to come to a consensus about respect and about how we want to be treated and how we can treat each other. So we don't necessarily need the 10 Commandments, but a lot of the time, even if you weren't looking at those, there would probably be overlap with what you would come up with and with what's written there. So it can be a really good foundation for coming up with rules for any community.
I think sometimes you should have rules to build a community.
I think that some people need the rules. I think that they should be there for the people who do, but for the people who don't, then great.
Thanks for listening to These Great Questions.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin, and our guests, Esther Ryder and Leah Tarachansky. Oh, and thanks also to students and teachers of the Morris Finchevsky Shula. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name's David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.